afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining Oasis for today's Sage 100 Tips and Tricks webinar. We will be focusing on period end processing today. So a little bit of housekeeping just in the very beginning is that your call or your phone will be muted during the presentation. However, you are allowed to ask questions. There is a question feature that should be on your screen, so feel free to enter in those questions. I will get to as many of those as I can. If due to time constraints I'm unable to get to all of the questions, I certainly will follow up with you after the presentation today. So please do not hesitate to ask any questions. And would like to introduce myself. I'm Pam Scott, the Director of Client Services with Oasis, and I will be doing your presentation today. So, period end processing. We're talking about this today because we find that a lot of individuals do not routinely close out their modules on a monthly basis. And a lot of times that could be related to just not having the time to do it, not understanding what it does, or in a lot of departments you might have a lot of turnover and they're not even aware that there's a period end processing function within Sage. So today we're going to cover a few of the modules, and I'm going to go in and show you some of the setups that are impacted when you do period end processing. So what I want to do is we're going to start with accounts payable. And most every module in your Sage 100 has a period end or year end functionality. There's a few exceptions to the rule, but if it's a module where you do processing or transactions, there typically is going to be a period end. The exception to that is the bank rec, and then modules where there are no, quote, transactions or processing, such as custom office, visual integrator, paperless office. Obviously, those do not have a period end processing. So in accounts payable, we're going to go to the setup first, and we're going to look at the AP options. And I'm going to show you some of the options for each of the modules, because what you want to do, so let's say after today's session you realize, you know what, I never knew I had to do period end processing. I've never done that. It might be open for the past, year or 2 years. Before you arbitrarily go in and start closing those periods to get caught up, you need to go in and take a look at your settings for each module. And I'm going to go through and give you an example of why. So I'm looking at my AP options, and at the top right, and every module is going to tell you what the current fiscal year is and the current period. The exception is payroll is going to be a calendar year, and then inventory gives you the choice, I believe, between a fiscal and a calendar year. Everything else is going to be on your fiscal or calendar year based on what you have set up in the general ledger module. And it's going to show you what the current period is. Now, one thing you do not want to do is you don't want to go into the setups and just arbitrarily change this to the proper period, because Sage actually goes through and has a process that it performs on the back end when you do that period end, purging data, bringing information forward as far as the general ledger is concerned, bringing balances forward. So this is where you're going to go in and take a look, but this is not where you're going to just arbitrarily change that to the next period. Also in accounts payable, you have your 1099 calendar year. So this is going to show you what your calendar year is. Forgive my demo data. If this was live data and I was keeping up with everything, it should show my current fiscal year as 2019, and it would show my current period as 8, and my 1099 calendar year would also be 2019. So again, this is demo data that we play around in. Then I'm going to move to my additional tab, and over on the right, I have an option that says days to retain paid invoices, and the minimum you can set it to is 0, and the maximum you can set it to is 999 days. You want to check this and make sure that you're retaining history for a lengthy enough period for, based on what your needs are. So what happens is when I do a period end processing in AP, Sage comes out and looks at this field, days to retain paid invoices. And if I had that set to a really low number like 30, then any paid invoices in that paid invoice history that were paid more than 30 days ago, it's going to purge those out of my system, so I can no longer do drill downs and look up that information. So you do want to make sure that you're keeping that for an adequate period of time. My opinion is I keep data typically for as long as the system will allow, but if for whatever reason you go in and somebody's got this set to 999 days and you really don't want to keep it that long, you could change it to like 365, do your period end. It will only keep the last year's worth of paid invoices, and then you could go back and then set this again to 999 if you wanted to start keeping data a little bit longer. Hopefully that makes sense. But so this is another field that you want to look at. And then in Accounts Payable on the History tab, you have years to retain vendor history. And the minimum in the newer versions is 2 years, and you can go up to 99 years. And the same way with retaining 1099 payment history. The minimum is 2 years, or you can take it up to 99 years. Now, if you're on a much, much, much older version, if you're going back to version 4.50 or something of that nature, and hopefully you're not running an old retired version, some of these settings can be different. So the main thing is, before you arbitrarily start closing, always go through the setup, take a look at the options, make sure you understand what it means before you do the period end processing. So that's what I wanted to show you in the Accounts Payable module. And so if I wanted to close out my Accounts Payable module before we move to the next section, is number one, and this is related to all of the modules, just not Accounts Payable. If you have any open, unposted transactions or batches in that module, it will not allow you to do period end processing. Because you may have a batch out there that you have forgotten to update that needs to be posted to August, and when you're trying to close August. So you're going to go to every module has a period end folder. You have a period end report selection, and this is where you can tell it what reports you want to print at period end. We used to do hard copies of all of these reports and keep them in folders. Now I would suggest that you keep an electronic copy, and you also have the ability in Paperless Office to actually tell it where you want to save those period end reports, and you can even do it by company as well. So you do have that option. So before you do the period end processing, you want to make sure all of your transactions are posted. You want to go into that module and print all of the applicable reports, and then you're going to go into period end. And as you'll notice, I immediately get a warning that says it cannot perform period end while AP invoice data entry is in progress. So that means that I have unposted AP invoices that either have to be cleared out or updated before it's going to actually let me go through the process. So I wanted to kind of show you that example of the warning that you're going to get within any module when you're doing that period end processing. So we're going to go in now and take a look at accounts receivable. And we're going to go into the setup and look at the AR options and show you some of the settings in there. So again, on the main tab, I have the current fiscal year and my current period. On the additional tab, I have the number of days to retain paid invoices. And again, this field will go up to 999 days, and it basically works the same as accounts payable. When you do period end, it's going to come out and take a look at the setting to say how long you want to keep those paid invoices in your history. And then if I go to the history tab, this is, there's a couple of different options in here. One is related to cash receipts, and this is asking how many years you want to keep your cash receipt history, and you can keep it up to 99, and the minimum should be 2 years. You can also say how many years of sales history you want to retain by customer or by salesperson. And again, the minimum is 2 years and the maximum is 99 years. So once you know that your settings are correct, you would go into period end processing. And I'm going to show you some of the steps that you would need to go through prior to that. I'm actually going to pull up some of the help screens because we're going to be covering a lot of information, and there's a lot of really good information within the help screens within Sage. But if I wanted to go directly to my period and report selection, again, I have a list of reports that it suggests that I print. I do not have to print all of them. I can actually remove reports from this list. Or I can also add reports if I want to add reports to the list. And then, excuse me, when I go into period end processing, if I have any unposted transactions, I'm going to get a warning like I did in accounts payable. If I do not have any unposted transactions, it's going to come up and say you're going to close accounts receivable period 5 ending 5/31/2020. And I've had people over the years say, well, you know what, we have an out of balance in May, but June is okay. Can I close June and leave May open? And the answer to that is no. You actually have to go in order. So if you have an out of balance in May, then you're going to have to leave May, June, July, and August open until you resolve the issue for May. At this point, if you're ready, I don't want to print any reports, I would click proceed. You get kind of one more chance before you click the button. It knows that I have not printed my period and reports. It tells me what period is going to be closed, what it's going to be changed to, and it's going to ask me if I want to complete this process. If I say yes, then what's going to happen is Sage in the background is going to go through and look at all of my settings to know how long I'm wanting to retain history to determine what needs to be purged out. I'm going to click yes, and then it goes through that process, and mine is basically done. Now, with my demo data, I have very little data or history out there, so it's going to go by quickly. You, on the other hand, it may take a few minutes for yours to go through and do the process. So let's say that you're new with the company, you go in and take a look at accounts receivable, and it has not been closed since January of 2019. Then what you want to do is, after you make sure that you're keeping history for an appropriate time, and I probably would set the minimum settings to the maximum number of days or years just until I get it cleaned up, you're going to have to go through that period in processing for each period. So if the last period closed was period 12 of 2018, you're going to have to go through and click and do period end for period 1. Then when you're finished, you can go in and run reports, do whatever you need for period 2, and so forth and so on. You can't lump it all together, and you should not go and change that option to a current period. So does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. If you do, please feel free to type in the question. A couple of other modules I wanted to show you, because like I said, we're not going to go through all of these modules today, but if you do have any questions about a particular module, you can let me know. In inventory, there are not many settings in the setup of your inventory options, but you do have, whether your inventory is based on months or periods, and you do have your current calendar year for inventory and your current period. And you would have your reports to run, and then there are other steps that you want to make sure that are completed before you do period end processing. And again, I'm going to show you some of the screens within Sage 100 within the help, because it actually gives you a checklist. So it gives you kind of a starting point so you know what to start with. So again, all of your modules, Bank Rec does not have a period end. All of your other modules do. When we go in and talk about the general ledger, now, most people typically have a certain date each month that all of the postings have to be in, and then that's when they close the period. So a lot of times that's the 10th of the month. And so they're working on getting everything reconciled so that they can get the financials and get everything completed and then closed for a particular month. But at the end of the year, a lot of times you cannot close December on January 10th because you're having to get all of your information to your CPA, and there's going to be adjusting entries. You may have audits that are going to provide adjusting entries. So it is perfectly okay to keep your general ledger open. But once you have those adjusting entries in, it's a good idea to go ahead then and go back and close that year and subsequent months. One really good reason why to do it that way and make sure you do go back and close it is if you have the general ledger open from 2016 and I'm doing data entry and I put in a posting date of 2016 by accident, the system is going to allow me to update to the general ledger in 2016. If 2016 is closed and I make that typo, it's going to say, hey, your system indicates that your current period is 5 of 2019, so we're not going to let you post to that closed period. So it helps make sure that you don't have any issues. I do see a question, so bear with me for just a second. The question is, do we recommend closing certain modules before others, and that they usually leave the general ledger to last? That is a great question, and yes, there is a recommended order for closing the modules. And I will open this, and basically I took this information directly from the help screen, and again, I'm going to show you all how to find all of this information. So this is the recommended closing order. Obviously, you may not have all of these modules, but this is the recommended closing order from Sage Software. And the we don't have a ton of folks that use bill of material, work order, or the barcode module. It wants to make sure you close purchase order before you close AP. You're going to close sales order before you close accounts receivable, and then you have your inventory. Payroll is listed at, as 8th on the list, but if you were on a version prior to 2018, you know that at the end of the year or at the end of the quarter, payroll has a quarterly close versus a monthly close. You have to close that quarter before you can process for the next quarter. So that's kind of a misnomer there that you may or may not be able to wait to close payroll. But then it recommends accounts receivable, payables, job cost, and then general ledger at the end. So there is a recommendation for the order of closing. So that should answer your question, and then I'll show you how to find that information very shortly. Okay, if there's any more questions, please feel free to submit them. So what I wanted to show you is very simply, and you should be able to do this in any version of Sage. What it populates might be just a little bit different if you're on a much older version. Today, I'm actually working in the 2018 version of Sage 100. But I went and clicked on Help. You can also use these resources in Information Center. But I clicked on Help and went to Help Topics. And I typed in period end. And so you'll see that anything that starts with the word period, it brings up, and it says period end checklist. So it lists various modules where a checklist exists. If it's not listed here, then Sage does not have one within their help screen. But if I click on accounts payable, it will then go through and say what the recommended checklist is. And actually, if you print this off, it has a little box to the left of the number, so you literally can use it as a checklist. But it walks you through, verify that all of your invoices and checks are recorded for the month. If you're doing it for December, things that you need to verify. And it goes down and gives you the entire list. It always talks about making a backup before you do period end processing. That's a good idea in case you accidentally close too many periods and you need to reopen something, especially if you have lost history that you didn't intend to lose by closing more periods than you intended. So it is good to have a backup. What you may want to do is make sure that you get a good backup the night before, which everyone should be getting backups on a nightly basis. You should be getting full backups, not incremental backups. So then maybe, in accounts payable, tell everybody first thing the next morning, don't do anything in accounts payable. I'm going to close July, and I'll let you know when you can get back in. So just kind of control it in that fashion. If I go to accounts receivable, this shows me a little bit more information. Again, it's saying make sure everything is posted. Then it says, if you calculate and do finance charges in your system, most people don't do that anymore within Sage, just because it takes more time to write them off than it does to actually collect the money. But it tells you to perform the finance charge. If you're going to print statements, if you do monthly statements, make sure you go ahead and your statements are printed for your customers. Print your sales tax report, and then it just kind of walks you through every recommended step. Obviously, you can add things to this list that's applicable to you or your business. And the general ledger one also has a good list. So it talks about making sure that you've updated everything, that you've run all of your registers, that you make any revisions to like any budget entries or anything of that nature. You've got your financials printed, you run your trial balance, and your GL detail report, making sure that you have all of those for the period before you actually then close it. So again, the modules that have a checklist, it's listed on the screen. And then if you'll notice right here where it says period in processing, there's another category. If I open that, it gives me various questions. And then here's addresses the person that wanted to know in what order should they be closed. So you could actually go in and see this. You could actually print this, copy and paste it to a Word document, so that you know the order that Sage recommends that you do the closing. So does anybody have any questions about that? There's really, not a lot to talk about period end, other than it is important, and it eliminates the someone actually going back and posting to an old period. Okay, so I see another question popped up. Can you go back and show us how to get the checklist? Absolutely. So what I did is, in my Sage, I clicked on Help at the top toolbar, Help, and I went to Help Topics, where it says type in a keyword defined. I typed in just the word, or started the word period. Here are and then it just, anything that starts with period end. As you can see, I've got, whoops, I went too far. So I went way too far. Let me just start from scratch. Sorry about that. So you can see that I do have quite a few. See, here's even more checklists. So some of them are going to take you to the same screen. Probably what they've done is they've combined old help screens with newer help screens. So you can see that even farther down there are more checklists. So what I did to get I'm sorry, did you say checklist? Yes, okay. So the checklist is under period end checklist, or you can scroll down a little bit and see period in processing, and you can see checklists there. And then to get the order, I clicked just on period in processing, and then it brought up questions, and it says in what order are modules to be closed. And I just clicked on the little plus sign, and it brought up the list. Okay. Okay, someone mentioned that it should be noted that that users cannot be in certain modules when you are trying to do a period in processing. So that is a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up. So you do have to, I'm sorry, I skipped to another question. So it is worth noting that if someone is working in possibly accounts receivable, you might not be able to close the sales order module. So it does involve some coordination with your staff. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate that. Is there any way to get around not being able to close AR if we have an unposted invoice? We sometimes have open AR invoices because we're waiting for the final approval, so the system won't let us complete period in processing. That is true. There is really no way to work around that. The Sage system is just set up that if there are unposted transactions, it wants you to update those. So there really is no way to get around that. And someone asked if did we lose audio? So if everyone can hear me, can you please raise your hand or put in a question or whether or not you can hear me. Okay. All right. So I had some folks raise their hand that evidently they still can hear me. Okay. Thank you, Dean. You said you can hear me. I know that I saw a minute ago that Teresa was listed as offline. So I'm not sure if something happened with the audio on her end. Okay. I'm going to go back and, whoops. Look at, okay, I don't see any other questions. If anybody does have an additional question, please let me know. If you are concerned about not have closed period end for a very long time, wanting to make sure that your settings are appropriate and kind of walk through and discuss with someone, all you need to do is call our help desk, and we will certainly be glad to connect to your system and walk through and take a look at everything. And let's see. I think I've covered all of the questions that have come in so far. If there's any additional questions about anything that we've covered, again, I'm not going to go through and cover every single module and what you need to check, but just grab your checklist. You know how to go into the options. The other thing that you might want to do is through the role maintenance, you also should limit who has access to actually perform period end processing. So not everyone should have access to that functionality because you don't want them accidentally going in and closing periods when they did not intend to. And the other thing that I will tell you, just kind of to reiterate, because we've had this happen before when folks were not real familiar with the process and trying to just get caught up. If we go back into the AP options, and it's asking us, let's see, that's a minimum of 2, so you can't mess up there. But on this one, it asks you how many days to retain paid invoices. If this actually accidentally gets changed to 0, the minute you do a period end processing, all of your paid invoices are basically going to kind of be purged out from the system, and you can't go back in and see those on like your invoice tab in vendor maintenance. And once you've purged those, there's no way to undo that unless you restore from a backup. So that's why it's important to make sure that your setting is correct, that you limit through role maintenance, number 1, who can do period end, and number 2, you should also be limiting who can get into the options of any module. Okay. All right. I'll leave it open for 1 more minute to see if anyone else has any questions. And if you do not have any additional questions, then we can go ahead and end the session today. I wanted to let you know that if you think of questions after the fact, you can email me at pam@oasisky.com. And if it's anything we've covered today, I'll certainly be glad to review that information. If you're wanting assistance on period end processing itself, you need to contact our help desk and get with them. The other thing is that this webinar is being recorded. So tomorrow, everyone, it may be later today, but at least by the end of day tomorrow, you should receive an email that will have a link to the webinar and you can review the recording. You can also share this information with any of your staff members. Share that recording with them, and it will also be on our website. So I'm not seeing any additional questions at the moment. So I would like to thank you for attending today, and we look forward to having you attend our next session. Thank you. Bye-bye.